U.S. Foreign Aid to Israel. Updated November 16, 2020. This report provides an overview of U.S. foreign assistance to Israel. It includes a review of past aid programs, data on annual assistance, and analysis of current issues. For general information on Israel, see Israel, Background and U.S. Relations in Brief, by Jim Zanotti. Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since World War II. Successive administrations, working with Congress, have provided Israel with significant assistance in light of robust domestic U.S. support for Israel and its security, shared strategic goals in the Middle East, a mutual commitment to democratic values, and historical ties dating from U.S. support for the creation of Israel in 1948. To date, the United States has provided Israel $146 billion, current, or non-inflation-adjusted, dollars in bilateral assistance and missile defense funding. At present, almost all U.S. bilateral aid to Israel is in the form of military assistance, although from 1971 to 2007, Israel also received significant economic assistance. In 2016, the U.S. and Israeli governments signed their third 10-year Memorandum of Understanding (MO) on military aid, covering fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2028. Under the terms of the MO, the United States pledged to provide, subject to congressional appropriation, $38 billion in military aid, $33 billion in foreign military financing grants plus $5 billion in missile defense appropriations to Israel. This MO followed a previous $30 billion 10-year agreement, which ran through fiscal year 2018. Israel is the first international operator of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the Department of Defense's fifth-generation stealth aircraft, considered to be the most technologically advanced fighter jet ever made. To date, Israel has purchased 50 F-35s in 3 separate contracts, funded with U.S. assistance. For fiscal year 2021, the Trump administration requested $3.3 billion in FMF for Israel and $500 million in missile defense aid to mark the second year of the MO. The administration also requested $5 million in migration and refugee assistance humanitarian funding for migrants to Israel. H.R. 7608 State, Foreign Operations, Agriculture, Rural Development, Interior, Environment, Military Construction, and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Act, 2021, which passed the House in July 2020, would, among other things, provide $3.3 billion in foreign military financing (FMF) for Israel. H.R. 7617 The Defense, Commerce, Justice, Science, Energy and Water Development, Financial Services and General Government, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Act, 2021, which passed the House in July 2020, would provide $500 million in joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense cooperation, of which $73 million for Iron Dome, $177 million for David's Sling, $77 million for Arrow 3, and $173 million for Arrow 2. Contents. Background and recent trends. 1. U.S. aid and Israel's advanced military technology. 2. Qualitative Military Edge (QME). 3. U.S. bilateral military aid to Israel. 5. The current 10-year Security Assistance Memorandum of Understanding (MO). 6. Foreign military financing (FMF) and arms sales. 8. Cash flow financing. 9. Early transfer and interest-bearing account. 9. F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. 10. KC-46A Pegasus. 11. Excess defense articles. 12. Defense budget appropriations for U.S.-Israeli missile defense programs. 13. Iron Dome. 13. Iron Dome's past performance. 14. Co-production and U.S. funding. 16. David's Sling. 17. Overview. 17. Co-production and U.S. funding. 18. The Arrow and Arrow 2. 18. High-altitude missile defense system, Arrow 3. 19. Emergency U.S. stockpile in Israel. 21. Defense budget appropriations authorization for anti-tunnel defense. 23. Defense Budget Appropriations Authorization for Countering Unmanned Aerial Systems. 24. Aid Restrictions and Possible Violations. 25. Arms Sales and Use of U.S. Supplied Equipment. 25. Human Rights Vetting Leahy Law. 26. Use of U.S. funds within Israel's pre-June 1967 borders. 27. Annexation and U.S. foreign aid to Israel. 28. Israeli arms transfers to third parties. 29. Israel and China. 29. Other ongoing assistance and cooperative programs. 31. Migration and refugee assistance. 31. Loan guarantees. 32. Overview. 32. Loan guarantees for economic recovery. 32. American Schools and Hospitals Abroad Program (ASHA). 34. U.S.-Israeli Scientific and Business Cooperation. 35. U.S.-Israeli Energy Cooperation (BIRD Energy). 37. U.S.-Israel Center of Excellence in Energy, Engineering and Water Technology Energy Center. 37. BIRD Homeland Security (BIRD HLS). 38. Fiscal Year 2021 Israel Assistance Legislation. 38. Figures. Figure 1. Phasing out offshore procurement (OSP) under the MO. 7. Figure 2. U.S. military aid to Israel over decades. 8. Figure 3. U.S. and Israeli F-35s fly-in formation. 10. Figure 4. F-35 helmet-mounted display. 11. Figure 5. Iron Dome launcher. 14. Figure 6. David's Sling launches Stunner Interceptor. 18. Figure 7. Army officers inspect WRSAI. 21. Tables. Table 1. Total U.S. foreign aid obligations to Israel, 1946 to 2020. 2. Table 2. Selected notified U.S. foreign military sales to Israel. 12. Table 3. U.S. contributions to the Arrow program Arrow, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3. 19. Table 4. Defense Budget Appropriations for U.S.-Israeli Missile Defense, Fiscal Year 2006 to Fiscal Year 2020. 20. Table 5. U.S.-Israeli Anti-Tunnel Cooperation. 24. Table 6. Migration and Refugee Assistance Funding Levels for Israel. 31. Table 7. U.S. Loan Guarantees to Israel, Fiscal Year 2003 Fiscal Year 2020. 34. Table 8. ASHA Program Grants from Israel Account, Fiscal Year 2000 Fiscal Year 2016. 35. Table A1. U.S. Bilateral Aid to Israel. 41. Appendixes. Appendix Bilateral Aid to Israel. 41. Contacts. Author information. 41. Background and recent trends. The United States and Israel have maintained strong bilateral relations based on a number of factors, including robust domestic U.S. support for Israel and its security, shared strategic goals in the Middle East, a mutual commitment to democratic values, and historical ties dating from U.S. support for the creation of Israel in 1948. U.S. foreign aid has been a major component in cementing and reinforcing these ties. U.S. officials and many lawmakers have long considered Israel to be a vital partner in the region, and U.S. aid packages for Israel have reflected this calculation. While some U.S. citizens have worked to cultivate U.S. support for Israel since its creation in 1948, in the years following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, advocates for Israel have engaged in organized, broad-based domestic efforts to foster bipartisan support in Congress for the bilateral relationship, including for U.S. aid to Israel. In recent years, however, that strong domestic support for Israel has become more of a subject of debate. 1. While both the Republican and Democratic parties have expressed unequivocal Republican Party Platform 2016, or ironclad Democratic Party Platform 2020 support for Israel, including aid, 2. Some Democrats from within the progressive wing of the party have become more vocal about conditioning, repurposing, or even cutting foreign aid to Israel. 3. For part of 2020, when Israel considered annexing part of the West Bank, a number of Democratic lawmakers took varying approaches to signaling their opposition to annexation. See below. some members warned in general terms that annexation would harm U.S.-Israeli relations, while others were more explicit in cautioning that should Israel go ahead, they might advance legislation that would have either cut aid or prohibited its use or application in annexed territories. The 2020 Abraham Accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates (UAE), and Bahrain, which normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and two Gulf Arab monarchies, may portend requests to Congress for a major increase in U.S. foreign aid and military sales to Israel in the years ahead. See Qualitative Military Edge (QME). Although not officially part of Israel's agreement with the UAE, the United States has proposed selling the UAE, among other things, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. To maintain Israel's technological superiority in arms over its neighbors, Israel and the United States are working on a package of offsetting sales and foreign aid to Israel. As of October 2020, the Trump administration was considering an acceleration of the timetable for delivering some of the remaining $26.4 billion in foreign military financing (FMF) grants to Israel, out of a total of $33 billion pledged in the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding (MO) to Israel, subject to the approval of Congress. The United States also may approve additional sales of the F-35 to Israel and accelerate the delivery of KC-46A refueling and transport aircraft to Israel. Table 1. Total U.S. foreign aid obligations to Israel, 1946 to 2020. Current, or non-inflation-adjusted, dollars in millions. Notes: the Green Book figures do not include missile defense funding provided by the Department of Defense. According to USAID data services as of March 2020, in constant 2018 U.S. dollars, inflation-adjusted, total U.S. aid to Israel obligated from 1946 to 2018 is $236 billion. U.S. aid and Israel's advanced military technology. Almost all current U.S. aid to Israel is in the form of military assistance. 4. U.S. military aid has helped transform Israel's armed forces into one of the most technologically sophisticated militaries in the world. Qualitative Military Edge (QME). U.S. military aid also has helped Israel build its domestic defense industry, which now ranks as one of the top global exporters of arms. 5. Israeli defense companies, such as Israel Aerospace Industries (IAI), Rafael, and Elbit Systems export nearly 70% of their products abroad. 6. Israel exports missile defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, cybersecurity products, radar, and electronic communication systems to, among others, India. 7. Azerbaijan, Vietnam, Thailand, South Korea, Singapore, Philippines, Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Russia, Brazil, and the United States. 8. In addition to the U.S. purchase of Iron Dome, see below, the United States has purchased, among other items, the following Israeli defense articles: Trophy active protection systems for M1 Abrams tanks, helmets for F-35 fighter pilots, and an electronic fence along the U.S.-Mexico border. Qualitative Military Edge (QME). U.S. military aid for Israel has been designed to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge over neighboring militaries. 9. The rationale for QME is that Israel must rely on better equipment and training to compensate for being much smaller in land area and population than most of its potential adversaries. 10. For decades, successive administrations, in conjunction with Congress, have taken measures to maintain Israel's QME in a number of ways. For example, in practice, U.S. arms sales policy has traditionally allowed Israel first regional access to U.S. defense technology. 11. In cases in which both Israel and an Arab state operate the same U.S. platform, Israel has first received either a more advanced version of the platform or the ability to customize the U.S. system. 12. In cases in which Israel objected to a major defense article sale to an Arab military, for example, the 1981 sale of Airborne Early Warning and Control System Aircraft or AWACS to Saudi Arabia, Congress has, at times, advocated for and legislated conditions on the usage and transfer of such weapons prior to or after a sale. 13. The United States has compensated Israel with, offsetting weapons packages or military aid when selling other U.S. major defense articles to a Middle Eastern military rival. See text box below. Over time, Congress codified informal QME-related practices in a way that encouraged a more deliberate interagency process for each major U.S. arms sale to Middle Eastern governments other than Israel. 14. In the 110th Congress, Representative Howard Berman sponsored legislation. H.R. 5916, Section 201, to carry out an empirical and qualitative assessment on an ongoing basis of the extent to which Israel possesses a qualitative military edge over military threats. After becoming chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, then-Chairman Berman was able to incorporate this language into the Naval Vessel Transfer Act of 2008, PL 110-429. The relevant QME provisions of this law had three primary elements. 1. They defined QME. 15. 2. They required an assessment of Israel's QME every 4 years. And 3. They amended the Arms Export Control Act 22 U.S.C. Section 2776 to require a determination, for any export of a U.S. defense article to any country in the Middle East other than Israel, that such a sale would not adversely affect Israel's QME. Preserving QME, offsetting weapons packages for Israel. The following specific instances supplement general U.S. efforts to strengthen Israel's QME, which are documented in a number of sources. 16. In 1992, after the United States announced a sale to Saudi Arabia of F-15 fighters, the George H.W. Bush administration provided Israel with Apache and Black Hawk helicopters, and pre-positioned U.S. defense equipment in Israel for Israeli use with U.S. approval, as various means of preserving Israel's QME. 17. In 2007, after the George W. Bush administration agreed to sell Saudi Arabia Joint Direct Attack Munitions, JDAMs, the administration reportedly agreed to sell more advanced JDAMs to Israel as a means of preserving its QME. 18. In 2010, the Obama administration agreed to sell an additional 20 F-35 aircraft to Israel as a means of preserving its QME in response to a sale to Saudi Arabia that included F-15s. 19. In 2013, after the Obama administration agreed to sell the UAE advanced F-16 fighters, then Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel announced that the United States would provide Israel with KC-135 refueling aircraft, anti-radiation missiles, advanced radar, and the sale of 6 V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft. 20. At the time, the U.S. proposal marked the first time that the United States had offered to sell tilt-rotor Ospreys to another country. Israel would eventually cancel its planned purchase of the V-22 due to budgetary constraints. Since the passage of the QME law and its amending of the Arms Export Control Act, the interagency process to assess Israel's QME has taken place behind closed doors with little fanfare. According to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency's DSCA Security Assistance Manual, QME determinations can be classified. 21. After a QME determination has been made regarding a specific proposed sale, DSCA includes a line in the applicable congressional notification reading, "The proposed sale will not alter the basic military balance in the region." At times, lawmakers have amended or attempted to amend aspects of the 2008 law. The U.S.-Israel Strategic Partnership Act, PL 113-296, amended Section 36 of the AECA to require that the administration explain, in cases of sales or exports of major U.S. defense equipment to other Middle Eastern states, what is Israel's capacity to address the improved capabilities provided by such sale or export. 22. In the 116th Congress, Representative Bradley Schneider sponsored H.R. 8494, the Guaranteeing Israel's QME Act of 2020, which requires the president to consult with Israeli officials before making a QME determination. 23. Another QME-related bill introduced in the 116th Congress is S. 4814, the Secure F-35 Exports Act of 2020. This legislation would, among other things, require a certification by the President before the provision of F-35 aircraft to a Middle Eastern country other than Israel that such sale will not undermine Israel's QME. At various times in the past, the U.S. government reportedly has held regular consultations with Israeli officials regarding the potential impact of regional arms sales on QME. 24. Some former Obama administration officials have responded to news of the possible sale of the F-35 to the UAE with criticism of what they perceive as a lack of time for U.S. officials and Congress to properly assess the transaction. Some have written that previous QME determinations encompassed classified negotiations that got to the heart of Israel's defense capabilities. 25. And that the process of military consultations with Israel on a given weapons system typically took several years of extensive defense shuttle diplomacy, completed before formally notifying Congress of the arms sale package. 26. U.S. bilateral military aid to Israel. Since 1999, overall U.S. assistance to Israel has been outlined in 10-year government-to-government Memoranda of Understanding (MOUs). MOUs are not legally binding agreements like treaties, and thus do not require Senate ratification. Also, Congress may accept or change year-to-year assistance levels for Israel, or provide supplemental appropriations. Nevertheless, past MOUs have significantly influenced the terms of U.S. aid to Israel. Congress has appropriated foreign aid to Israel largely according to the terms of the MOU in place at the time. Brief history of MOUs on U.S. aid to Israel. The first 10-year MOU, fiscal year 1999 to fiscal year 2008, agreed to under the Clinton administration, was known as the Glide Path Agreement, and represented a political commitment to provide Israel with at least $26.7 billion in total economic and military aid over its duration, of which $21.3 billion was in military aid. 27. This MOU provided the template for the gradual phase out of all economic assistance to Israel. In 2007, the Bush administration and the Israeli government agreed to a second MOU consisting of a $30 billion military aid package for the 10-year period from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2018. Under the terms of that agreement, Israel was explicitly permitted to continue spending up to 26.3% of U.S. assistance on Israeli-manufactured equipment, known as offshore procurement or OSP, discussed below. The agreement stated that both sides acknowledge that these funding levels assume continuation of adequate levels for U.S. foreign assistance overall, and are subject to the appropriation and availability of funds for these purposes. 28. The current 10-year Security Assistance Memorandum of Understanding (MOU). At a signing ceremony at the State Department on September 14, 2016, representatives of the U.S. and Israeli governments signed another 10-year Memorandum of Understanding on military aid covering fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 2028. Under the terms of this third MOU, the United States pledges, subject to congressional appropriation, to provide $38 billion in military aid, $33 billion in foreign military financing grants, plus $5 billion in defense appropriations for missile defense programs to Israel. According to the terms of the MOU, both the United States and Israel jointly commit to respect the FMF levels specified in this MOU, and not to seek changes to the FMF levels for the duration of this understanding. 29. Figure 1. Phasing out offshore procurement (OSP) under the MOU. The terms of the 2019 to 2028 MOU differ from previous agreements on issues such as phasing out offshore procurement (OSP). Under the terms of the third MOU, OSP will decrease slowly until fiscal year 2024, but will then be phased out more dramatically over the MOU's last 5 years, ending entirely in fiscal year 2028. See Figure 1. The MOU calls on Israel to provide the United States with detailed programmatic information related to the use of all U.S. funding, including funds used for OSP. In response to the planned phase out of OSP, some Israeli defense contractors may be seeking to merge with U.S. companies or open U.S. subsidiaries in order to continue their eligibility for defense contracts financed through FMF. 30. Missile defense. Under the terms of the third MOU, the administration pledges to request $500 million in annual combined funding for missile defense programs with joint U.S.-Israeli elements, such as Iron Dome, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3, and David's Sling. Previous MOUs did not include missile defense funding, which has traditionally been appropriated via separate interactions between successive administrations and Congresses. While the MOU commits both the United States and Israel to a $500 million annual U.S. missile defense contribution, It also stipulates that under exceptional circumstances, major armed conflict involving Israel, both sides may agree on U.S. support above the $500 million annual cap. No FMF for fuel. According to the third MO, Israel will no longer be permitted to use a portion of its FMF to purchase fuel, or other consumables, from the United States. Under the second MO, Israel had budgeted an estimated $400 million a year in FMF to purchase jet fuel from the United States. Congressional appropriators have indicated in annual foreign assistance legislation that they support FMF used to subsidize Israeli purchases of U.S. jet fuel. 31. In July 2020, DSCA notified Congress of a major defense sale to Israel of 990 million gallons of petroleum-based products, including jet fuel, for an estimated cost of $3 billion. 32. Figure 2. U.S. military aid to Israel over decades. Notes: figures included foreign military financing only. Missile defense funds are not included. Figures are not adjusted for inflation. Foreign military financing, FMF, and arms sales. Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. foreign military financing. For fiscal year 2021, the President's request for Israel would encompass approximately 59% of total requested FMF funding worldwide. Annual FMF grants to Israel represent approximately 20% of the overall Israeli defense budget. 33. Israel's defense expenditure as a percentage of its gross domestic product, 5.3% in 2019, is one of the highest in the world. 34. Cash flow financing. Section 23 of the Arms Export Control Act, 22 U.S.C. Section 2763, authorizes the President to finance the procurement of defense articles, defense services, and design and construction services by friendly foreign countries and international organizations, on such terms and conditions as he may determine consistent with the requirements of this section. Successive administrations have used this authority to permit Israel to finance multi-year purchases through installment payments, rather than having to pay the full amount of such purchases up front. 35. Known as cash flow financing, this benefit enables Israel to negotiate major arms purchases with U.S. defense suppliers with payments scheduled over a longer time horizon. 36. Early transfer and interest-bearing account. Since fiscal year 1991, PL 101-513, Congress has mandated that Israel receive its FMF aid in a lump sum during the first month of the fiscal year. 37. The Further Consolidated Appropriations Act, Fiscal Year 2020, PL 116-94, states that of the funds appropriated under this heading, not less than $3,300 million shall be available for grants only for Israel, which shall be disbursed within 30 days of enactment of this act. Once disbursed, Israel's military aid is transferred to an interest-bearing account with the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. 38. Israel has used interest collected on its military aid to pay down its bilateral debt, non-guaranteed, to U.S. government agencies, which, according to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, stood at $148.8 million as of December 2015. 39. Israel cannot use accrued interest for defense procurement inside Israel. F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Israel is the first declared international operator of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, 40. It has purchased 50 F-35s called Adirs. 41. In 3 separate contracts, see Table 2, using foreign military financing grants. As of September 2020, Israel had received 27 of 50 jets, which they have divided into 2 squadrons based at Nevatim Air Base in southern Israel. 42. From there and without any aerial refueling, Israel's F-35s could strike targets in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and most of Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. 43. To date, Israel reportedly has used its F-35 aircraft to conduct aerial strikes inside Syria. 44. The Department of Defense's F-35 program is an international cooperative program in which Israel and Singapore are considered security cooperation participants, outside of the F-35 Cooperative Development Partnership. 45. As a result, Israel is not eligible to assign staff to the F-35 Joint Program Office in Washington and does not receive full F-35 technical briefings. 46. The United States government and Lockheed Martin retain exclusive access to the F-35 software code, which Israel cannot alter itself. Figure 3. U.S. and Israeli F-35s fly in formation. Joint exercise Enduring Lightning 3, October 2020. Figure 4. F-35 helmet-mounted display. Made by Israeli manufacturer Elbit Systems. Note, the F-35 helmet-mounted display is a joint venture between Elbit Systems and Rockwell Collins. However, Israel's involvement in the F-35 program is still extensive, with Israeli companies making F-35 wingsets (IAI) and helmets Elbit Systems. Israel also received significant development access to the F-35 and the ability to customize its planes with Israeli-made C4 command, control, communications, computers systems, under the condition that the software coding be done by the United States. In 2018, the Navy awarded Lockheed Martin a $148 million contract for the procurement of Israel Unique Weapons Certification, modification kits, and electronic warfare analysis. 47. Software upgrades called Block 3F+, added to the main computer of Israel's F-35s does reportedly facilitate the use of Israeli-designed electronic equipment and weaponry, thereby permitting Israel to employ its own external jamming pod and also allow internal carriage of indigenous air-to-air missiles and guided munitions. 48. In October 2020, the United States and Israel conducted their third Enduring Lightning joint aviation exercise using the F-35. American and Israeli pilots trained together to counter both surface and air adversaries, while supporting units assisted with refueling, radar, and opponent simulations. KC-46A Pegasus. In March 2020, DSCA notified Congress of a planned sale to Israel of 8 KC-46A Boeing, Pegasus aircraft for an estimated $2.4 billion. 49. According to Boeing, the KC-46A Pegasus is a multi-role tanker, can carry passengers, fuel, and equipment that can refuel all U.S. and Allied military aircraft. After Japan, Israel is the second country approved by the United States to receive the KC-46A. The Israel Air Force's current fleet of tankers was originally procured in the 1970s, and it is anticipated that Israel will be able to use the KC-46A to refuel its F-35 fighters. Table 2. Selected notified U.S. foreign military sales to Israel. 50. Notes, all figures and dates are approximate. Excess Defense Articles. The Excess Defense Articles (EDA) program provides a means by which the United States can advance foreign policy objectives, assisting friendly and allied nations through provision of equipment in excess of the requirements of its own defense forces. This program, managed by DSCA, enables the United States to reduce its inventory of outdated equipment by providing friendly countries with necessary supplies at either reduced rates or no charge. 51. As a designated, major non-NATO ally, 52. Israel is eligible to receive EDA under Section 516 of the Foreign Assistance Act and Section 23 of the Arms Export Control Act. According to DSCA, from 2010 to 2019, Israel received at least $385 million in EDA deliveries, current value only. 53. Defense budget appropriations for U.S.-Israeli missile defense programs. Congress and successive administrations have demonstrated strong support for joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense projects designed to thwart a diverse range of threats. Threats include short-range missiles and rockets fired by non-state actors, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, to mid- and longer-range ballistic missiles in Syria's and Iran's arsenals. 54. Congress provides regular U.S. funding for Israeli and U.S.-Israeli missile defense programs in Defense Authorization and Appropriations bills. Israel and the United States each contribute financially to several weapons systems and engage in co-development, co-production, and/or technology sharing in connection with them. Since 2001, Israel and the United States have conducted a joint biennial ballistic missile defense exercise, called Juniper Cobra, to work on integrating their weapons, radars, and other systems. 55. The following section provides background on Israel's four-layered active defense network: Iron Dome, short range, David's Sling, low to mid-range, Arrow 2, upper atmospheric, and Arrow 3, exo-atmospheric. Iron Dome. Iron Dome is a short-range anti-rocket system, intercept range of 2.5 to 43 miles, developed by Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and originally produced in Israel. Iron Dome's targeting system and radar are designed to fire its Tamir interceptors only at incoming projectiles that pose threats to the area being protected. Generally, strategically important sites, including population centers, it is not configured to fire on rockets headed toward unpopulated areas. Israel can move Iron Dome batteries as threats change. Currently, Israel has 10 Iron Dome batteries deployed throughout the country, and each battery is designed to defend a 60-square-mile populated area. 56. As of January 2020, Iron Dome has carried out more than 2,400 operational interceptions. 57. Figure 5. Iron Dome Launcher. Iron Dome's past performance. Iron Dome was declared operational in 2011. Its first major test came in November 2012 during a week-long conflict termed Operation Pillar of Cloud Defense by Israel between Israel and various Palestinian militant groups, including Hamas. Israeli officials claim that Iron Dome intercepted 85% of the more than 400 rockets fired by Gaza-based militants. 58. Between 2012 and 2014, Israel upgraded Iron Dome's various tracking and firing mechanisms. During Israel's 2014 conflict with Hamas and other Palestinian militants, media reports, generally based on Israeli claims, seem to indicate that Iron Dome had a successful interception rate close to 90%. 59. 5 Israeli civilians were killed by rocket fire between July and August 2014. According to the Israel Defense Forces (IDF) and Jane's Defense Weekly, during a two-day conflict in May 2019 with Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip, Israel's Iron Dome achieved an 86% successful interception rate against rockets fired at urban areas. 60. In that time period, 3 Israelis were killed by rocket fire. A commander of the Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas, claimed during the May 2019 conflict that Hamas had overcome the so-called Iron Dome by adopting the tactic of firing dozens of rockets in a single burst. The high intensity of fire and the great destructive ability of the missiles caused great losses and destruction to the enemy. 61. According to an assessment by Uzi Rubin, a former head of the Israel Missile Defense Organization, Iron Dome faced challenges it never did before, and it faced them quite well. There is no 100% defense, never, it's against the laws of physics. Even if you manage to hit every incoming missile, there's Newton's law, even the debris must come down. 62. In addition to Iron Dome, Israel also has extensive homeland security policies and alerts designed to protect civilians, such as mobile phone applications that warn of incoming missiles, bomb shelters in neighborhoods, and regulations requiring the construction of safe rooms in homes near the Gaza border. 63. Co-production and U.S. funding. To date, the United States has provided $1.6 billion to Israel for Iron Dome batteries, interceptors, co-production costs, and general maintenance. See Table 4. Because Iron Dome was developed by Israel alone, Israel initially retained proprietary technology rights to it. The United States and Israel have had a decades-long partnership in the development and co-production of other missile defense systems, such as the Arrow. As the United States began financially supporting Israel's development of Iron Dome in fiscal year 2011, U.S. interest in ultimately becoming a partner in its co-production grew. Congress then called for Iron Dome technology sharing and co-production with the United States. 64. In March 2014, the United States and Israeli governments signed a co-production agreement to enable the manufacture of components of the Iron Dome system in the United States, while also providing the U.S. Missile Defense Agency (MDA) with full access to what had been proprietary Iron Dome technology. 65. U.S.-based Raytheon is Rafael's U.S. partner in the co-production of Iron Dome. 66. U.S. Army procurement of Iron Dome. Ongoing U.S. efforts to acquire Iron Dome have come in the context of lawmakers' concern over a lack of capability to protect American soldiers deployed overseas from possible sophisticated cruise missile attacks. Consequently, Congress directed the Army to take interim steps to procure additional systems. 67. Section 112 of PL 115-232, the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, required the Secretary of Defense to certify whether there is a need for the U.S. Army to deploy an interim missile defense capability, fixed site, cruise missile defense capability, and, if so, to deploy additional batteries. In response to this mandate, the U.S. Army evaluated several systems for its Expanded Mission Area Missile Program, Iron Dome, Norwegian Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, and IFPC Increment 2 and, in January 2019, chose to procure 2 Iron Dome batteries from Rafael for a cost of $373 million. The Army justified the purchase by referencing Iron Dome's high interception rate as well as the Tamir interceptor's low cost relative to existing U.S. missile defense systems. 68. However, the Army so far has declined to purchase additional Iron Dome batteries. Reportedly, Israel has refused to share Iron Dome's source code with U.S. counterparts, who would like to customize and integrate Iron Dome with other U.S. missile defense systems. 69. The U.S. Marine Corps also is evaluating Iron Dome and has not expressed the same desires as the Army about the system being interoperable with the Corps' missile defense systems. 70. After Israel's summer 2014 conflict with Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups, there was high Israeli demand for additional Tamir interceptors, Iron Dome batteries, and the external financing to procure these items. 71. On September 30, 2014, Raytheon received a $149 million contract from Rafael to provide parts for the Tamir interceptor. With U.S. co-production, around 60% to 70% of the components of the Tamir interceptor are now manufactured in the United States before final assembly in Israel. 72. Israel also maintains the ability to manufacture Tamir interceptors within Israel. In December 2019, Israel agreed to export 8 ELM 2084 multi-mission radars, the radar system used by Iron Dome, to the Czech Republic for $125 million. Israel has already exported variants of the radar system to Canada, Singapore, Finland, and India. David's Sling. Overview. In August 2008, Israel and the United States officially signed a project agreement to co-develop the David's Sling system. 73. David's Sling, aka Magic Wand, is a short-medium-range system designed to counter long-range rockets and slower-flying cruise missiles fired at ranges from 25 miles to 186 miles, such as those possessed by Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. David's Sling is designed to intercept missiles with ranges and trajectories for which Iron Dome and/or Arrow interceptors are not optimally configured. It has been developed jointly by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Raytheon. David's Sling uses Raytheon's Stunner missile for interception, and each launcher can hold up to 16 missiles. In April 2017, Israel declared David's Sling operational and, according to one analysis, 2 David's Sling batteries are sufficient to cover the whole of Israel. 74. Figure 6. David's Sling launches Stunner interceptor. Israel first used David's Sling in July 2018. At the time, Syrian regime forces were attempting to retake parts of southern Syria as part of the ongoing conflict there. During the fighting, Assad loyalists fired 2 SS-21 Tochka or Scarab tactical ballistic missiles at rebel forces, but the missiles veered into Israeli territory. David's Sling fired 2 Stunner interceptors, but the final impact point of the Syrian missiles changed mid-flight, and Israel ordered one of the interceptors to self-destruct. The other most likely landed in Syrian territory. 75. Chinese media alleged that Assad regime forces recovered the Stunner interceptor intact and handed it over to Russia. The Israeli government has not commented on this report. 76. Co-production and U.S. funding. Since fiscal year 2006, the United States has contributed over $1.9 billion to the development of David's Sling, see Table 4. In June 2018, the United States and Israel signed a co-production agreement for the joint manufacture of the Stunner interceptor. Some interceptor components are built in Tucson, Arizona, by Raytheon. The Arrow and Arrow 2. Under a 1986 agreement allowing Israel to participate in the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, the United States and Israel have co-developed different versions of the Arrow anti-ballistic missile, and since 1988, Israel and the United States have engaged in joint development. 77. The Arrow is designed to counter short-range ballistic missiles. The United States has funded just under half of the annual costs of the development of the Arrow weapon system, with Israel supplying the remainder. The total U.S. financial contribution for all Arrow systems exceeds $3.7 billion. See Table 3. The system became operational in 2000 in Israel and has been tested successfully. The Arrow 2 program, officially referred to as the Arrow System Improvement Program or ASIP, a joint effort of Boeing and IAI, is designed to defeat longer-range ballistic missiles. One Arrow 2 battery is designed to protect large swaths of Israeli territory. In March 2017, media sources reported the first known use of the Arrow 2, when they said that it successfully intercepted a Syrian surface-to-air missile SAM, that had been fired on an Israeli jet returning to Israel from an operation inside Syria. In August 2020, nearly 20 years after the first Arrow system became operational, Israel successfully tested the Arrow 2 system. According to one account of the test, Arrow 2 successfully intercepted a Sparrow-simulated long-range, surface-to-surface missile, which could one day be fired at Israel by Iran. 78. Table 3. U.S. contributions to the Arrow program Arrow, Arrow 2, and Arrow 3. Dollars in millions. High-altitude missile defense system Arrow 3. Citing a potential nuclear threat from Iran, Israel has sought a missile interceptor that operates at a higher altitude and greater range than the original Arrow systems. In October 2007, the United States and Israel agreed to establish a committee to evaluate Israel's proposed Arrow 3, an upper-tier system designed to intercept medium-range ballistic missiles outside the atmosphere. The Arrow 3 is a more advanced version, in terms of speed, range and altitude, of the current Arrow 2 interceptor. In 2008, Israel decided to begin development of the Arrow 3 and the United States agreed to co-fund its development despite an initial proposal by Lockheed Martin and the Department of Defense (DoD), urging Israel to purchase the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense (THAAD) missile defense system instead. In March 2019, the United States deployed a THAAD missile battery to Israel. The Arrow 3, made like the Arrow 2 by IAI and Boeing, has been operational since January 2017. In July 2010, the United States and Israel signed a bilateral agreement, the Upper Tier Interceptor Project Agreement, to extend their cooperation in developing and producing the Arrow 3, including an equitable U.S.-Israeli cost share. U.S.-Israeli co-production of Arrow 3 components is ongoing. 79. A U.S.-based subsidiary of IAI, Stark Aerospace Inc. based in Columbus, Mississippi, is producing canisters for the Arrow 3 system. Since co-development began in 2008, Congress has appropriated $1.1 billion for Arrow 3, see Table 4. In January 2019, the United States and Israel conducted a successful test of Arrow 3 over the Mediterranean, and in July 2019, Arrow 3 successfully intercepted targets in a series of tests at the Pacific Spaceport Complex Alaska, PSCA, in Kodiak, Alaska. Table 4. Defense budget appropriations for U.S.-Israeli missile defense, fiscal year 2006 to fiscal year 2020. Current dollars in millions. A. These funds were not appropriated by Congress but reprogrammed by the Obama administration from other Department of Defense accounts. Figure 7. Army officers inspect WRSAI. Emergency U.S. stockpile in Israel. In the early 1980s, Israeli leaders sought to expand what they called their strategic collaboration with the U.S. military by inviting the United States to stockpile arms and equipment at Israeli bases for American use in wartime. 80. Beginning in 1984, the United States began to stockpile military equipment in Israel, but only single-use armaments that could not be used by the Israel Defense Forces. 81. In 1989, the George H. W. Bush administration decided to alter the terms of the stockpile and provide Israel access to it in emergency situations. 82. At the time, the United States was attempting to sell Saudi Arabia M1A1 tanks, and U.S. officials sought Israel's acquiescence to the deal. Section 514 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, 22 U.S.C. Section 2321H, allows U.S. defense articles stored in war reserve stocks to be transferred to a foreign government through foreign military sales or through grant military assistance, such as FMF. Congress limits the value of assets transferred into War Reserve Stock Allies (WRSA) stockpiles located in foreign countries in any fiscal year through authorizing legislation. See below. The U.S. retains title to the WRSA stocks, and title must be subsequently transferred before the foreign country may use them. The United States European Command (EUCOM) manages the War Reserve Stock Allies Israel (WRSAI) program. The United States stores missiles, armored vehicles, and artillery ammunition in Israel. 83. According to one Israeli officer, officially, all of this equipment belongs to the U.S. military. If, however, there is a conflict, the IDF Israel Defense Forces can ask for permission to use some of the equipment. 84. According to one expert, WRSAI is a strategic boon to Israel. The process is streamlined, number 60-day congressional notification is required, and there's no waiting on delivery. 85. In February 2019, as part of the bilateral military exercise Juniper Falcon 2019, officers from the 405th Army Field Support Brigade simulated a transfer of munitions from the WRSAI to Israeli Defense Forces control. Since 1989, Israel has requested access to the stockpile on at least 2 occasions, including during the summer 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel requested that the United States expedite the delivery of precision-guided munitions to Israel. In order to accomplish this, the George W. Bush administration did not use the emergency authority codified in the Arms Export Control Act, AECA, but rather allowed Israel to access the WRSAI stockpile. In July 2014, during Israeli military operations against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the Defense Department permitted Israel to draw from the stockpile, paid with FMF, to replenish 120 tank rounds and 40 illumination rounds fired from grenade launchers. 86. Section 7049(b)(4) of PL 116-6, the Fiscal Year 2019 Consolidated Appropriations Act, extended the authorization of WRSAI through fiscal year 2020. 87. Section 1273 of PL 115-232, the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, extended the authority for WRSAI through fiscal year 2023. At times, Congress has passed legislation that has authorized EUCOM to increase the value of materiel stored in Israel. According to DSCA, it should be understood that no new procurements are involved in establishing and maintaining these stockpiles. Rather, the defense articles used to establish a stockpile in the annual authorized editions represent defense articles that are already within the stocks of the U.S. Armed Forces. The stockpile authorizing legislation simply identifies a level of value for which a stockpile may be established or increased. 88. Stockpiling precision-guided munitions for Israel. Since 2014, Israel has requested that the United States military increase its own stockpile of precision-guided munitions (PGMs) stored in Israel for possible Israeli emergency use against Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist groups. Section 1273 of PL 115-232, the John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, authorizes the President to conduct a joint assessment of the quantity and type of PGMs necessary for Israel in the event of a prolonged war. If such an assessment is completed, Section 1273 requires that the administration share its assessment with Congress. In 2015, DSCA notified Congress of possible foreign military sales to Israel for joint direct attack munition tail kits, munitions, and associated equipment, parts and logistical support for an estimated cost of $1.879 billion. See Table 2 above. If EUCOM has contributed the maximum amount legally permitted in each applicable fiscal year, then the non-inflation-adjusted value of materiel stored in Israel would currently stand at $3.4 billion. The following legislation authorized increases in value to the stockpile: Fiscal year 1990, PL 101-167, the Foreign Operations, Export Financing, and Related Programs Appropriations Act, 1990, provided $165 million for all stockpile programs and expanded their locations to include Korea, Thailand, NATO members, and countries which were then major non-NATO allies: Australia, Japan, Korea, Israel and Egypt. Although the act did not specify funds for Israel, of the $165 million appropriated, $10 million was for Thailand, $55 million was for South Korea, and $100 million was intended as an initial authorization for Israel. 89. Fiscal year 1991, PL 101-513, the Foreign Operations, Export Financing, and Related Programs Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1991, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel, not less than $300 million in value for fiscal year 1991. Fiscal year 1993, PL 102-391, the Foreign Operations, Export Financing, and Related Programs Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1993, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel, not less than $200 million in value for fiscal year 1993. Fiscal year 1994, PL 103-87, the Foreign Operations, Export Financing, and Related Programs Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1994, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for fiscal year 1994. Fiscal year 1995, PL 103-306, the Foreign Operations, Export Financing, and Related Programs Appropriations Act for fiscal year 1995, authorized a total addition to defense articles in Israel of $200 million for fiscal year 1994 and 1995. Fiscal year 2007, fiscal year 2008, Section 13(2)(a) (I) of the Department of State Authorities Act of 2006, PL 109-472, amended Section 514 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, as amended, PL 87-195, 22 U.S.C. Section 2321H, to authorize additions to defense articles in Israel of up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2007 and fiscal year 2008. 90. Fiscal year 2011, fiscal year 2012. PL 111-266, the Security Cooperation Act of 2010, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2011 and fiscal year 2012. Fiscal year 2014, fiscal year 2015, PL 113-296, the United States-Israel Strategic Partnership Act of 2014, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2014 and fiscal year 2015. Fiscal year 2016, fiscal year 2017, Section 7034 K11B of PL 114-113, the fiscal year 2016 Consolidated Appropriations Act, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2016 and fiscal year 2017. Fiscal year 2018, fiscal year 2019, Section 7034 L7 of PL 115-141, the fiscal year 2018 Consolidated Appropriations Act, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019. Fiscal year 2019, fiscal year 2020, Section 7048B-4B of PL 116-6, the fiscal year 2019 Consolidated Appropriations Act, authorized additions to defense articles in Israel up to $200 million in value for each of fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020. Defense Budget Appropriations Authorization for Anti-Tunnel Defense. In 2016, the Israeli and U.S. governments began collaborating on a new system to detect underground smuggling tunnels and to counter cross-border tunnels used, most prominently by Hamas in the summer 2014 conflict, to infiltrate Israel. Reportedly, this technology uses acoustic or seismic sensors and software to detect the sounds of digging by monitoring vibrations. Underground. 91. This technology may be based on discovery techniques used in the oil and natural gas sector. 92. Section 1279 of PL 114-92, the fiscal year 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, authorized the establishment of a U.S.-Israeli anti-tunnel cooperation program. 93. This authorization allowed funds from the Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation Defense-wide account to be used in combination with Israeli funds to establish anti-tunnel capabilities that detect, map, and neutralize underground tunnels that threaten the United States or Israel. The authorization requires the Secretary of Defense to report to Congress on, among other things, the sharing of research and development costs between the United States and Israel. Table 5. U.S.-Israeli anti-tunnel cooperation. Current U.S. dollars in millions. Defense budget appropriations authorization for countering unmanned aerial systems. As unmanned aerial vehicle technology has proliferated across the Middle East, Israel has sought U.S. assistance in countering various systems used by state and non-state actors alike. In order to counter unmanned drones, states are researching various methods to detect incoming unmanned aircraft, using radio or optical sensors, and then either disabling, destroying, or even seizing them by either jamming their communications, intercepting their flight paths, or hacking their electronic systems. 94. Congress first authorized a cooperative U.S.-Israeli Counter-Unmanned Aerial Systems (CUAS) program by expanding the scope of the Anti-Tunnel Cooperation Program, Defense Budget Appropriations for U.S.-Israeli Missile Defense Programs. Then, in the fiscal year 2020 NDAA, PL 116-92, Congress created a separate authority, Section 1278, which authorized the Secretary of Defense to carry out research, development, test, and evaluation activities, on a joint basis with Israel, to establish capabilities for countering unmanned aerial systems that threaten the United States or Israel. Section 1278 requires a matching contribution from the government of Israel and caps the annual U.S. contribution at $25 million. Congress authorized the program through 2024. For fiscal year 2020, the joint explanatory statement accompanying PL 116-93, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, 2020, included $13 million under Combating Terrorism Technology Support for the CUAS program. For fiscal year 2021, H.Rept. 116-453 accompanying H.R. 7617, the fiscal year 2021 Defense Appropriations Bill, would provide $25 million for CUAS under Combating Terrorism Technology Support. Aid restrictions and possible violations. U.S. aid and arms sales to Israel, like those to other foreign recipients, are subject to U.S. law. Some U.S. citizens and interest groups periodically call upon Congress to ensure that U.S. military assistance to Israel is conditioned on the Israeli government's compliance with applicable U.S. laws and policies and with international humanitarian law. Arms sales and use of U.S.-supplied equipment. 95. The 1952 Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement and subsequent arms agreements between Israel and the United States limit Israel's use of U.S. military equipment to defensive purposes. 96. The Arms Export Control Act (AECA), 22 U.S.C. Section 2754, authorizes the sale of U.S. defense articles and services for specific purposes, including legitimate self-defense. 97. The AECA 22 U.S.C. Section 2753 states that recipients may not use such articles, for purposes other than those for which they have been furnished, without prior presidential consent. 98. The Act stipulates that sale agreements entered into after November 29, 1999, must grant the U.S. government the right to verify credible reports that articles have been used for unauthorized purposes. The Foreign Assistance Act (FAA) of 1961, as amended, also contains general provisions on the use of U.S.-supplied military equipment. 99. It is the statutory responsibility of the Departments of State and Defense, pursuant to the AECA, to conduct end-use monitoring to ensure that recipients of U.S. defense articles use such items solely for their intended purposes. The AECA also provides authority to the President through a presidential determination and Congress joint resolution to prohibit the sale or delivery of U.S. origin defense articles to a recipient country if it has used such articles, for a purpose not authorized by the AECA or the FAA. 100. Questions over the misuse of U.S.-supplied equipment to Israel have arisen in several instances in past decades, including over the sale of tear gas to Israel during the late 1980s. 101. The sale of Caterpillar D9 bulldozers to Israel allegedly used in the destruction of Palestinian homes. 102. And Israel's use of U.S.-supplied cluster munitions in Lebanon. 103. In March 2020, 64 representatives wrote a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo posing a series of questions. 104. Out of concern that Israel may have been using U.S. origin construction equipment to demolish the homes of Palestinians that Israel has accused of committing terrorism. 105. The members specifically requested an examination of Israeli compliance with the requirements applied to recipients of U.S. origin defense articles pursuant to the Arms Export Control Act of 1976, AECA, as amended 22 U.S.C. 2751, et. SEQ, and a determination as to whether a report to Congress on this issue is required by Section 3(c)(2) of AECA, 22 U.S.C. 2753. Human Rights Vetting Leahy Law. 106. Section 620M of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 FAA, as amended, prohibits the furnishing of assistance authorized by the FAA and the AECA to any foreign security force unit where there is credible information that the unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. The State Department and U.S. embassies overseas implement Leahy vetting to determine which foreign security individuals and units are eligible to receive U.S. assistance or training. In February 2016, Senator Leahy and 10 other members of Congress sent a letter to then Secretary of State John Kerry asking the State Department to determine whether alleged extrajudicial killings or torture by Israeli military and police, and Egypt separately, should trigger Leahy law restrictions. 107. In its response to Congress, the State Department stated that no Israeli individual or unit potentially involved in the letter's alleged incidents had been submitted to receive U.S. assistance. 108. H.R. 2407 promoting human rights for Palestinian children living under Israeli Military Occupation Act. In the 115th Congress, Representative Betty McCollum introduced a bill, H.R. 4391, promoting human rights by ending Israeli military detention of Palestinian Children Act, that would have, among other things, prohibited U.S. assistance to Israel, notwithstanding any other provision of law, from being used to support the military detention, interrogation, or ill treatment of Palestinian children in violation of international humanitarian law. This bill was referred to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it did not see further committee or floor action. In the 116th Congress, Representative McCollum introduced an amended version of the legislation, H.R. 2407, that, rather than specifically addressing U.S. military assistance to Israel, would alter Section 620M of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, 22 U.S.C. 2378d, commonly known as the Leahy Law, by prohibiting foreign assistance to a foreign country that may be used to support the military detention, interrogation, abuse, or ill treatment of children in violation of international humanitarian law. H.R. 2407 also would authorize $19 million each year for non-governmental organizations monitoring possible human rights abuses associated with reported Israeli military detention of Palestinian children. Gross violations of internationally recognized human rights are currently defined in Section 502b(d)(1) of the FAA, 22 U.S.C. 2304d(1) to include torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges and trial, causing the disappearance of persons by the abduction and clandestine detention of those persons, and other flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of person. The U.S. State Department currently issues annual country reports on human rights practices that regularly reference non-government sources. 109. Use of U.S. funds within Israel's pre-June 1967 borders. In some instances, U.S. assistance to Israel may be used only in areas subject to the administration of Israel prior to June 1967, see, loan guarantees. For example, U.S. State Department provided MRA assistance, see, Migration and Refugee Assistance, per agreement between the State Department and United Israel Appeal, may only be used for absorption centers, Ulpanim, intensive Hebrew language schools with particular focus on immigrants to Israel, or Youth Aliyah, relocation to Israel, institutions located within Israel's pre-June 1967 area of control. 110. Until recently, no program funded by the endowments of U.S.-Israeli binational foundations, see, U.S.-Israeli Scientific and Business Cooperation, could be conducted in geographic areas which came under the administration of the Government of Israel after June 5, 1967, and may not relate to subjects primarily pertinent to such areas. 111. In October 2020, the Trump administration announced that it had removed geographic restrictions from the founding agreements establishing the three main U.S.-Israeli binational foundations BIRD, BARD, BSF, thereby permitting universities in the West Bank to apply for grant funding. 112. Annexation and U.S. foreign aid to Israel. During part of 2020, after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu formed a coalition government to end more than a year of political uncertainty in Israel, he considered unilaterally annexing parts of the West Bank in order to fulfill earlier campaign pledges to his supporters. 113. The May 2020 power-sharing agreement with Defense Minister Benny Gantz authorized Netanyahu to present the issue of annexation before either the Cabinet or Knesset for a vote, but only after July 1, 2020. In August 2020, the United Arab Emirates and Israel publicly announced that they had, in principle, reached an agreement, whereby the UAE would normalize diplomatic relations with Israel in exchange for Israel suspending its annexation plans. 114. Both sides reached a formal diplomatic agreement, known as the Abraham Accords, in September 2020 and, since then, the issue of annexation has remained tabled. During spring and summer 2020, before the issue of annexation was put aside, some Democrats in Congress took various steps to signal their opposition to Israel's planned annexation of parts of the West Bank. In the House, 191 Democrats, 81% of the Democratic caucus, wrote a letter to Israeli leaders that expressed their deep concern with annexation plans and urged the Israeli government to reconsider. 115. Another letter, addressed to Secretary Pompeo, warned U.S. officials that if Israel proceeded with annexation, the 12 House signatories and one senator were prepared to ensure non-recognition of annexed territories as well as pursue legislation that conditions the $3.8 billion in U.S. military funding to Israel to ensure that U.S. taxpayers are not supporting annexation in any way. We will include human rights conditions and the withholding of funds for the offshore procurement of Israeli weapons equal to or exceeding the amount the Israeli government spends annually to fund settlements, as well as the policies and practices that sustain and enable them. 116. In August 2020, Representative Betty McCollum introduced H.R. 8050, the Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which would, among other things, prohibit FMF and other defense funds from being used to support certain activities in West Bank territory that had been unilaterally annexed by Israel. In the Senate, 19 Senate Democrats sent a May 2020 letter to Israeli leaders warning them that if they moved annexation forward, we would not support that action. This is consistent with long-standing American policy opposing unilateral actions by either party to the conflict. 117. Then, Senator Van Hollen filed an amendment to S. 4049, the Senate's version of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, which would have prohibited funds authorized in the bill, or any other act, from being used to support the deployment of United States defense articles, services, or training to territories in the West Bank unilaterally annexed by Israel after July 1, 2020, or to facilitate the unilateral annexation of such territories. 118. The amendment was not made in order during Senate consideration of the fiscal year 2021 NDAA. 119. Israeli arms transfers to third parties. Per Section 3 of the Arms Export Control Act AECA 22 U.S. Code Section 2753, and Section 505E, of the Foreign Assistance Act 22 U.S. Code Section 2314, the U.S. government must review and approve any transfer of U.S. origin equipment from a recipient to a third party that was not previously authorized in the original acquisition. 120. Third-party transfer, or TPT, is the retransfer of title, physical possession or control of defense articles from the authorized recipient to any person or organization not an employee, officer or agent of that recipient country. 121. As previously mentioned, Israel is a major global manufacturer of armaments. Yet, it also possesses significant quantities of major U.S. origin defense equipment stemming from its decades-old security partnership with the United States. At times, third parties have sought to procure U.S. equipment used by Israel, and U.S.-Israel differences over approval of retransfer has at times caused friction in the bilateral relationship. For example, in 2017, Croatia solicited bids for the procurement of fighter aircraft and, a year later, chose to purchase 12 used F-16 Barak fighters from Israel in a deal worth an estimated $500 million, conditioned on U.S. TPT approval. In December 2018, the Trump administration notified Congress that it had approved the sale, but only if all Israeli modifications were removed beforehand. Reportedly, Croatia did not want the F-16s returned to their original condition, and the deal was cancelled despite high-level negotiations between Israeli and U.S. officials. 122. Israel and China. Amidst ongoing global U.S.-Chinese competition in various fields, Israel's defense and technology trade with China has at times come under U.S. scrutiny. 123. Since the middle of the last decade, Israeli defense exports to China have nearly ceased. Two planned Israeli sales to China drew significant opposition both from successive administrations and from Congress. PHALCON airborne radar systems in 2000 and upgrade of Chinese Harpy killer drone aircraft in 2004-2005. 124. As a result of U.S. pressure on Israel to cease its long-standing and sometimes clandestine defense relationship with China, Israel created its own arms export control agency, known as the Defense Export Control Agency (DECA). In addition, the United States and Israel signed a 2005 bilateral agreement, known as the Declaration of Understanding on Technology Exports, whereby both countries pledged to ensure defense export transparency, with the United States pledging not to ban Israel's defense deals on commercial grounds to ensure Israeli competitiveness globally. 125. Though Israeli-Chinese defense ties have essentially ended, China is now Israel's second-largest single-state trading partner, after the United States, and there is still some concern that Israeli technology transfer in the commercial sphere will be used by China to compete with the United States and potentially threaten its national security in various fields, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and robotics. 126. According to one analyst, since they cannot buy defense equipment from Israel, Chinese companies with links to the country's military have looked to civilian technologies instead, particularly those adaptable to military use. 127. Partly due to U.S. concerns regarding China's involvement in Israel's economy, Israel created an advisory panel on foreign investment in Israel in late 2019. 128. However, this panel reportedly does not have the authority to review investments in sectors such as high-tech that accounted for most of China's investments in Israel in the previous decade. 129. Apparently, debate continues within Israel's government about how to balance economic interests with national security concerns. 130. Chinese investment in Israel also has raised some concern within the administration and Congress. Section 1289 of PL 116-92, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020, expressed a sense of the Senate that the United States government should urge the government of Israel to consider the security implications of foreign investment in Israel. According to one Israeli analysis, President Trump reportedly warned Prime Minister Netanyahu in March 2019 that U.S. security assistance for and cooperation with Israel could be limited if Chinese companies establish a 5G communications network in Israel, in line with similar warnings that the administration has communicated to other U.S. allies and partners. 131. Additionally, a state-owned Chinese company, the Shanghai International Port Group, has secured the contract to operate a new terminal at Haifa's seaport for 25 years, beginning in 2021, and another state-owned Chinese company, a subsidiary of China Harbor Engineering Company, is developing Ashdod's new port. Both Haifa and Ashdod host Israeli naval bases. Due to the Chinese contract for Haifa, the U.S. Navy is reportedly reconsidering its practice of periodically docking there. 132. In spring 2020, after the United States again raised concern over Chinese investment in major Israeli projects, the subsidiary of a Hong Kong-based company lost a bid to build Israel's largest desalination plant. Shortly before Israel announced the bid decision, Secretary of State Michael Pompeo visited Israel and publicly stated, "We do not want the Chinese Communist Party to have access to Israeli infrastructure, Israeli communication systems, all of the things that put Israeli citizens at risk and in turn put the capacity for America to work alongside Israel on important projects at risk as well." 133. The United States and Israel also are reportedly nearing a deal whereby Israel would pledge not to choose a Chinese technology company to build its 5G next-generation mobile network. 134. Other ongoing assistance and cooperative programs. Migration and refugee assistance. Since 1973, Israel has received grants from the State Department's Migration and Refugee Assistance Account, MRA. 135. To assist in the resettlement of migrants to Israel. Funds are paid to the United Israel Appeal, a private philanthropic organization in the United States, which in turn transfers the funds to the Jewish Agency for Israel. 136. Between 1973 and 1991, the United States gave about $460 million for resettling Jewish refugees in Israel. Annual amounts have varied from a low of $5 million to a high of $80 million, based at least partly on the number of Jews leaving the former Soviet Union and other areas for Israel. Table 6. Migration and refugee assistance funding levels for Israel. Congress has changed the earmark language since the first refugee resettlement funds were appropriated in 1973. At first, the congressional language said the funds were for resettlement in Israel of refugees from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and from communist countries in Eastern Europe. But starting in 1985, the language was simplified to refugees resettling in Israel, to ensure that Ethiopian Jews would be covered by the funding. Technically, the legislative language designates funds for refugee resettlement, but in Israel little differentiation is made between Jewish refugees and other Jewish immigrants, and the funds are used to support the absorption of all immigrants. Loan guarantees. Overview. Since 1972, the United States has extended loan guarantees to Israel to assist with housing shortages, Israel's absorption of new immigrants from the former Soviet Union and Ethiopia, and its economic recovery following the 2000-2003 recession, which was probably caused in part by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict known as the Second Intifada. Loan guarantees are a form of indirect U.S. assistance to Israel, since they enable Israel to borrow from commercial sources at lower rates. Congress directs that subsidies be set aside in a U.S. Treasury account in case of a possible Israeli default. These subsidies, which are a percentage of the total loan, based in part on the credit rating of the borrowing country, have come from the U.S. or the Israeli government. Israel has never defaulted on a U.S.-backed loan guarantee. Loan guarantees for economic recovery. In 2003, then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon requested an additional $8 billion in loan guarantees to help the Israeli government stimulate Israel's then ailing economy. The loan guarantee request accompanied a request for an additional $4 billion in military grants to help Israel prepare for possible attacks during an anticipated U.S. war with Iraq. PL 108-11, the fiscal year 2003 Emergency Wartime Supplemental Appropriations Act authorized $9 billion in loan guarantees over 3 years for Israel's economic recovery and $1 billion in military grants. PL 108-11 stated that the proceeds from the loan guarantees could be used only within Israel's pre-June 5, 1967, area of control, that the annual loan guarantees could be reduced by an amount equal to the amount Israel spends on settlements outside of Israel's pre-June 1967 area of control, that Israel would pay all fees and subsidies, and that the President would consider Israel's economic reforms when determining terms and conditions for the loan guarantees. 137. On November 26, 2003, the Department of State announced that the $3 billion in loan guarantees for fiscal year 2003 were reduced by $289.5 million because Israel continued to build settlements in the occupied territories and continued construction of a security barrier separating key Israeli and Palestinian population centers. 138. In fiscal year 2005, the U.S. government reduced the amount available for Israel to borrow by an additional $795.8 million. Since then, Israel has not borrowed any funds. According to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Israel is legally obligated to use the proceeds of guaranteed loans for refinancing its government debt and also has agreed that proceeds shall not be used for military purposes or to support activities in areas outside its pre-June 5, 1967, areas of control, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. However, U.S. officials have noted that since Israel's national budget is fungible, proceeds from the issuance of U.S. guaranteed debt that are used to refinance Israeli government debt free up domestic Israeli funds for other uses. 139. As of 2020, Israel has issued $4.1 billion in U.S.-backed bonds. 140. After deducting the amounts mentioned above, Israel might still be authorized to issue up to $3.814 billion in U.S.-backed bonds. However, if the Israeli government sought to issue new U.S.-backed bonds, it is unclear whether the loan guarantees available to Israel might be subject to reduction based on Israel's estimated cumulative subsequent expenditures for settlements in the West Bank. Since the original loan guarantee program authorization for Israel in 2003, Congress has extended the program 4 times. 141. The program is currently authorized through the end of fiscal year 2023. In general, Israel may view U.S. loan guarantees as a last resort option, which its treasury could use if unguaranteed local and international bond issuances become too expensive. According to one Israeli official in 2012, we consider the loan guarantees as preparation for a rainy day. This is a safety net for war, natural disaster and economic crisis, which allows Israel to maintain economic stability in unstable surroundings. 142. Israeli officials may believe that although they have not used the loan guarantees in the last 14 years, maintaining the program boosts the country's fiscal standing among international creditors in capital markets. Table 7. U.S. loan guarantees to Israel, fiscal year 2003 to fiscal year 2020. Current dollars in millions. American Schools and Hospitals Abroad Program (ASHA) .143. Through Foreign Operations Appropriations legislation, Congress has funded the ASHA program as part of the Overall Development Assistance (DA) appropriation to the United States Agency for International Development (USAID). According to USAID, ASHA is designed to strengthen self-sustaining schools, libraries, and medical centers that best demonstrate American ideals and practices abroad. ASHA has been providing support to institutions in the Middle East since 1957, and a number of universities and hospitals in Israel have been recipients of ASHA grants. In fiscal year 2019, the most recent year for which data are available, ASHA grant recipients in Israel West Bank included Shaarei Zedek Hospital in Jerusalem, the Feinberg Graduate School of the Weizmann Institute of Science, and the Nazareth Project, Inc. According to USAID, institutions based in Israel have received the most program funding in the Middle East region. Table 8. ASHA program grants from Israel account. Fiscal year 2000 to fiscal year 2016. U.S.-Israeli Scientific and Business Cooperation. In the early 1970s, Israeli academics and businessmen began looking for ways to expand investment in Israel's nascent technology sector. The sector, which would later become the driving force in the country's economy, was in need of private capital for research and development at the time. The United States and Israel launched several programs to stimulate Israeli industrial and scientific research, and Congress has on several occasions authorized and appropriated 144 funds for this purpose to the following organizations: the Byrd Foundation, Israel U.S. Binational Research and Development Foundation. 145. Byrd, which was established in 1977, provides matchmaking services between Israeli and American companies in research and development with the goal of expanding cooperation between U.S. and Israeli private high-tech industries. The mission of the foundation is to stimulate, promote and support joint non-defense industrial R&D of mutual benefit to the two countries. 146. Projects are supported in the areas of homeland security, communications, electronics, electro-optics, software, life sciences, and renewable and alternative energy, among others. 147. According to the foundation, $363 million in grants have been awarded to 1,000 projects. Awards typically range from $700,000 to $900,000. The award size varies based on total project budget and other considerations. The recipients must provide at least 50% of the total project budget. While support for military projects is not a part of the program, several of the completed ventures have yielded products that might be useful in a military setting, including the Aircraft Enhanced Vision System (EVS) camera, which is designed to provide day-night improved orientation during taxiing or flying. It allows visual landing in reduced visibility conditions, such as fog, haze, dust, smog, etc. The foundation also funded the creation of a through-wall location and sensing system that is portable and detects whether people are present behind walls, how many, and where they are situated. 148. The BSF Foundation, U.S.-Israel Binational Science Foundation. 149. BSF, which was started in 1972, promotes cooperation in scientific and technological research. Since 2012, BSF has partnered with the National Science Foundation, NSF, to jointly fund collaborative U.S.-Israeli scientific research. In August 2019, Israel's Council of Research announced that it would provide $56 million over a 5-year period to expand the BSF-NSF program. The Bard Foundation, Binational Agriculture and Research and Development Fund. BARD was created in 1978 and supports U.S.-Israeli cooperation in agricultural research. 150. In the 115th Congress, PL 115-334 amended the original 1977 Authorization of Binational Agricultural Cooperation by adding that BARD should promote research in drip irrigation, pesticides, aquaculture, livestock, poultry, disease control, and farm equipment. In 1995, the United States and Israel established the U.S.-Israel Science and Technology Foundation, USISTF, to fund and administer projects mandated by the U.S.-Israel Science and Technology Commission, USISTC. 151. A bilateral entity jointly established by the United States Department of Commerce and the Israel Ministry of Industry, Trade, and Labor in 1994 to foster scientific, technological, and economic cooperation between the two countries. Since 2007, Congress has repeatedly authorized and appropriated funds for the creation of new U.S.-Israeli cooperative programs in various fields. Most of these new programs fall under the administrative purview of the Byrd Foundation. They include the following: U.S.-Israeli Energy Cooperation, Byrd Energy. Byrd Energy is a cooperative program between the U.S. Department of Energy and the Israeli Ministry of Energy designed to further research in renewable energy and energy efficiency. It is nominally part of the Byrd Foundation. Congress authorized the creation of the program in Section 917 of PL 110-140, the Renewable Fuels, Consumer Protection, and Energy Efficiency Act of 2007. 152. Although the law did not appropriate any funds for joint research and development, it did establish a grant program to support research, development, and commercialization of renewable energy or energy efficiency. The law also authorized the Secretary of Energy to provide funds for the grant program as needed. Congress authorized the program for 7 years from the time of enactment, which was on December 19, 2007. Then, in December 2014, the President signed into law PL 113-296, the United States-Israel Strategic Partnership Act of 2014, which reauthorized the U.S.-Israeli Energy Cooperation Program for an additional 10 years until September 30, 2024. Congress and the administration have provided a total of $21.7 million for bird energy to date. 153. As of 2019, total combined U.S. and Israeli investment in bird energy for 41 approved projects stood at $37.69 million. U.S.-Israel Center of Excellence in Energy, Engineering and Water Technology. Energy Center. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Energy and the Israeli Energy Ministry agreed to establish a new program known as the U.S.-Israel Center of Excellence in Energy, Engineering and Water Technology, the Energy Center. To date, Congress has appropriated $154.12 million for the center, and the Israeli government and private sector partners have matched those funds for initial seed money of $24 million. 155 potential research areas identified by the Energy Center include energy cybersecurity in critical infrastructure, energy storage, and production and utilization of natural gas. According to the center, the maximum award for a single consortium is $10 million for a period of 5 years. 156. Bird Homeland Security, Bird HLS. The Bird Foundation also manages the Bird Homeland Security Program, a cooperative undertaking between the U.S. Department of Homeland Security (DHS) and the Israel Ministry of Public Security (MOPS) to further joint research of advanced technologies for homeland security. 157. Currently, DHS's Science and Technology Directorate, S&T, is working together with Israeli counterparts to develop technologies for first responders. 158. To date, Congress has provided a total of $9 million in funding for Bird HLS, of which $4 million was specified in conference report language accompanying fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019 Homeland Security appropriation legislation for a binational cooperative pilot program. Congress appropriated $2 million for Bird HLS in fiscal year 2020. 159. The remaining $3 million came in the form of three $1 million Homeland Security Department grants, fiscal year 2016 to fiscal year 2018, for a first responders program. 160. Fiscal year 2021 Israel Assistance Legislation. H.R. 7608 State, Foreign Operations, Agriculture, Rural Development, Interior, Environment, Military Construction, and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Act, 2021, which passed the House in July 2020, would provide, including in directives in the accompanying H-Rept. 116 to 444, $3.3 billion in foreign military financing for Israel, $5 million in MRA to resettle Jewish refugees in Israel. An extension of the authorization for Israel to access the War Reserve stockpile through fiscal year 2023, an addition to the value of war materiel in the War Reserve stockpile by $600 million total over a 3-year period from 2021 to 2023, $10 million in Economic Support Funds (ESF) to help support the Ethiopian-Israeli community, lawmaker support for funds directed toward the Special Defense Acquisition Fund to be used to transfer precision-guided munitions to reserve stocks for Israel, $2 million in ESF for an Eastern Mediterranean Partnership Joint Dialogue, an annual event in the United States with Israel, Greece, and Cyprus designed to promote energy independence and regional cooperation, authorization to establish a people-to-people partnership for Peace Fund, to provide funding for projects to help build the foundation for peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians and for a sustainable two-state solution. Lawmaker support for future Israeli purchases of jet fuel from the United States using U.S. military aid, and lawmaker support for USAID to allocate $2 million toward a cooperative development program between USAID and Israel's Mashav, Israel's foreign aid agency, to address international water, agriculture, and energy sustainability. 161. H.R. 6395 and S. 4049 with SAMDT 2301, the William M. Mac. Thornberry National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, which passed the House and Senate in July 2020, would authorize $500 million in joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense cooperation. The House version specified $77 million for Arrow 3, $50 million for David's Sling, $73 million for Iron Dome, and $300 million for Arrow 2. In the House, a U.S.-Israeli grant program to facilitate research to aid the diagnosis and treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In the Senate, the creation of a U.S.-Israel Operations Technology Working Group to provide a standing forum for the United States and Israel to systematically share intelligence-informed military capability requirements and deepen their defense partnership, and the inclusion of S. 3176, the United States-Israel Security Assistance Authorization Act of 2020, into the bill. 162. H.R. 7617, the Defense, Commerce, Justice, Science, Energy and Water Development, Financial Services and General Government, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Act, 2021, which passed the House in July 2020, would provide $500 million in joint U.S.-Israeli missile defense cooperation, of which $73 million for Iron Dome, $177 million for David's Sling, $77 million for Arrow 3, and $173 million for Arrow 2, $47.5 million for U.S.-Israeli anti-tunneling cooperation, $25 million for U.S.-Israeli counter-unmanned aerial systems cooperation, $4 million for National Institutes of Health Office of the Director to establish a pilot program to support research and development jointly with Israel for effective responses to COVID-19, and $2 million for Bird Energy and $4 million for the U.S.-Israel Center of Excellence in Energy, Engineering and Water Technology. 163. Appendix. Bilateral aid to Israel. Table A1 shows cumulative U.S. aid to Israel for fiscal year 1951 through fiscal year 2018 in current dollars. Table A1. U.S. bilateral aid to Israel. Millions of dollars, current non-inflation adjusted. Author information. Jeremy M. Sharp, Specialist in Middle Eastern Affairs.